There's a specific sound a man hears when his patience finally snaps. It ain't a loud crack like a rifle shot or a boom like thunder. It's quieter than that. Almost like the sound of a dry branch giving way under too much snow. A silent surrender that turns into an avalanche. For me, that sound didn't come when they trespassed the first time, or even the second. It came the day a drone buzzed over my grandfather's barn like a mechanical mosquito, and I found myself staring down the barrel of Old Bess, my 12-gauge, realizing that the world had gone crazy and left me behind to clean up the mess. My name is Elias Thorne, and for 60 years, I've been breathing in the dust of Ironwood County, a place where the dirt is red, the sun is unforgiving, and a handshake used to mean you were legally bound by honor, not ink. I manage the Thorne Legacy Ranch, a modest spread of 300 acres that my granddaddy clawed out of the scrub brush back when this part of the country was nothing but rattlesnakes and prayers. It's not much to look at if you don't know what you're seeing, just a patchwork of cedar, tough grass, and barbed wire. But it holds the sweat of 3 generations of Thorne men, and that kind of equity doesn't show up on a spreadsheet. I never minded the solitude. In fact, I preferred it because cows don't lie to you and the wind doesn't try to sell you insurance. But then came the excavators, roaring like monsters over the southern ridge, tearing up the earth to build something they called Willow Creek Heights. It sounded like a retirement home for elves, but it was just a suburban sprawl of cookie-cutter McMansions, houses so close together you could hear your neighbor sneeze, with lawns that looked like they were painted on with green spray paint. I stayed on my side of the fence, minding my business, assuming that good fences make good neighbors. But I learned real quick that some neighbors don't believe in fences, they believe in conquest. The first time I met the enemy, the air smelled of ozone and fresh asphalt, and I was greasing the tractor when I saw them standing at my gate, a man and a woman who looked like they'd been manufactured in a factory that makes uncomfortable smiles. The woman, holding a clipboard like it was the 10 Commandments, introduced herself as Linda Prescott, head of the Community Cohesion Committee, a title that sounded made up to justify being nosy. "Mr. Thorne," she chirped, her voice high and tight, "we're just so excited to welcome you into the fold. Logically speaking, your property is a visual extension of our community, and we have some concerns about the rustic nature of your perimeter." I just looked at her, wiped the grease on a rag, and told her, "Ma'am, this ain't a visual extension of anything. It's a working cattle ranch, and unless you're here to buy a steer, you're standing on private property." She blinked, like a robot encountering a syntax error, and exchanged a look with her partner, a guy who was busy taking pictures of my barn with his phone like it was a zoo exhibit. They left that day with tight smiles, but I knew, deep in my gut, that they weren't done, because people like Linda Prescott don't hear no. They hear try harder. That was the beginning of the Cold War. It started with friendly suggestions, letters in my mailbox asking if I'd considered painting my barn a neutral beige to match the Willow Creek aesthetic, or if I could move my cattle to the north pasture because they were disturbing the zen of the yoga moms on their back patios. I ignored them, threw the letters in the burned barrel, and went about my work, but then the suggestions turned into demands, and the demands turned into surveillance. I'd be out checking the lines, and I'd see them, little clusters of people in polo shirts standing on the ridge, pointing, taking notes, treating my livelihood like a blight on their property values. Then came the drones, buzzing low over my head, spooking the heifers, hovering over my porch while I drank my morning coffee. Invasive little eyes in the sky looking for a violation I hadn't committed. I decided to start keeping a record, a ledger of every intrusion, every drone flight, every time a stranger in designer boots hopped my fence to take a selfie with a cow, because my daddy taught me that in a fight between a rich man and a poor man, the poor man needs twice as much proof. Things shifted gears when the money man showed up, a slick character driving a silver luxury SUV that cost more than my house, wearing a suit that had never seen a speck of dust. He pulled up to the gate one afternoon, smiling that shark smile, introduced himself as Marcus Trent, a land acquisition specialist representing a private equity firm, though he swore up and down he had no love for the HOA. "Elias," he said, using my first name like we were old war buddies, "you're sitting on a gold mine here, and frankly, the development pressure isn't going away, so I'm here to offer you a lifeboat, a cash buyout, way over market value. enough to retire to Florida and never smell cow manure again. I leaned on the fence post, looked him in the eye, and saw nothing but greed reflecting back. "Marcus," I said, "you drive back down that road until the pavement ends, and then keep driving, because my history isn't for sale, and neither is my future." He didn't get angry, which worried me more than if he had. He just nodded, tapped his folder, and said, "Everyone has a price, Elias. Sometimes the cost just isn't money, it's peace of mind." That threat hung in the air long after his dust settled, and I went back to the house, pulled up the footage from the trail cams I'd hidden in the mesquite trees, and saw something that made my blood run cold. 3 nights before, that same silver SUV had been parked down by the creek, and Marcus Trent had been standing there handing a thick envelope to none other than Linda Prescott. They weren't separate entities, the HOA and the developers. They were a two-headed snake, one head squeezing me with rules and harassment, the other waiting to swallow the land when I finally suffocated. I realized then that they weren't just annoying neighbors. They were conspirators, scheming to drive me off the land my grandfather bled for. I sat at my kitchen table that night, the glow of the monitor illuminating the lines on my face, and I looked over at old Bess leaning in the corner. I knew they wanted a reaction. They wanted the crazy old rancher to wave a gun and scream so they could call the cops and paint me as a danger to the community, but I wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. I was going to give them something much worse. I was going to give them a war, but I wouldn't fight it with bullets. I'd fight it with their own weapon: paperwork, patience, and the absolute, unyielding stubbornness of a man who knows exactly where he stands. The escalation didn't happen overnight. It crept in like rot in a floorboard, soft at first until your foot goes right through. After I turned down Marcus Trent, the polite veneer of Willow Creek Heights completely dissolved, replaced by a calculated campaign of bureaucratic terror designed to bury me under a mountain of fines and misery. It started with the official notices, white envelopes taped to my gate like eviction notices, citing me for things that weren't even crimes in this county. First, it was an odor violation claiming my manure piles were a biohazard. Then a visual nuisance citation because my tractor was parked in view of the street, followed by a visit from animal control because someone reported my cattle looked depressed. I handled each one, pulling permits from 1975, showing vet records, proving that I was exempt from their suburban bylaws. But it was like fighting a hydra. You cut off one head, and 3 more printouts appeared in the mailbox. Then, the attacks moved from paper to physical, cowardly little strikes in the dark meant to break my spirit. I woke up one Tuesday to find 200 pounds of construction debris, drywall, jagged rebar, broken tiles, dumped right in the middle of my south pasture, creating a hazard for the herd. A day later, I found the main irrigation line smashed with a sledgehammer, flooding the lower field and turning my best grazing land into a swamp. But the moment that truly shifted the ground beneath my feet happened on a Thursday morning, when I walked out to the barn and saw my tractor, the John Deere my father had bought in the 80s, sitting on its rims. All 4 massive tires had been slashed deep, the rubber gaping like open wounds, and my tablet, which I used to monitor the water levels, lay shattered on the concrete floor. I stood there in the silence, listening to the wind whistle through the gaps in the barn wood, feeling a rage so cold it made my hands shake. This wasn't a dispute anymore. This was a siege. I called the only lawman I trusted, Sheriff Big Jim Calloway, a man I'd known since high school football days, who rolled up in his cruiser looking tired, his gray mustache drooping like he carried the weight of the whole county on his upper lip. He looked at the tires, then at the debris, and finally at me, his eyes grim. "Elias," he said, keeping his voice low. "You need to know something. We got a walk-in at the station yesterday. A young guy from the Willow Creek board, scared out of his mind, said he couldn't be part of what was coming next." He handed me a small USB drive, wrapped in a tissue. He gave us a recording. Linda Prescott is on there, clear as day, talking about stage 2. They aren't just trying to annoy you into selling, Elias. They're planning to trigger an environmental seizure. They want to spike your pond with industrial fertilizer, cause a massive algae bloom and fish kill, and then report you to the EPA for groundwater contamination. I gripped that USB drive until the plastic edges bit into my palm. They were willing to poison the earth, poison the water table that fed their own manicured lawns, just to get rid of one stubborn old man. I can't move on them yet, Sheriff Calloway admitted, looking pained. Linda has friends in the DA's office, slippery friends. I need hard proof of them in the act, or a direct link to the money. Otherwise, her lawyers will spin this as a disgruntled board member making deep fakes. I'll get you the proof, I said, my voice sounding strange to my own ears, hollow and hard. Don't do anything stupid, Elias, he warned, climbing back into his truck. I'm done being stupid, I told him. Now I'm going to be smart. I went inside and made 2 calls. The first was to Sarah Jenkins, a bulldog of a lawyer in Austin who specialized in land disputes and hated HOAs more than she hated weakness. The second was to Maya Rostova, an investigative journalist with a blog called The Rural Guard, who had been sniffing around the story for weeks. We met at my kitchen table, plotting like generals. Sarah listened to the tapes, her face turning red with fury. This is RICO territory, she muttered. Conspiracy, extortion, environmental terrorism. Elias, if we nail this, we don't just stop them, we incinerate them. But we needed to force their hand. We needed them to panic, to make a mistake. So, I decided to give them a show. The next morning, I rented a massive yellow backhoe and parked it prominently on the ridge, right where the Willow Creek busybodies could see it. I spent 3 days digging random, menacing-looking trenches in zigzag patterns, moving dirt piles from left to right, looking busy and secretive. I didn't put up signs, I didn't explain myself, I just dug. The neighborhood forums went nuclear. Maya showed me screenshots of their frantic posts. Is he building a moat? Is that a pig farm foundation? Is he burying toxic waste? It worked exactly as intended. Fear makes predators sloppy. A few nights later, my hidden cameras picked up movement. It was Marcus Trent, the investor, sneaking onto the property with a flashlight, trying to figure out what I was building. I watched on the monitor as he slipped on the loose dirt of a fresh trench and slid halfway down, covering his expensive suit in red mud. But instead of running him off, I let him go, because the next day, he came back, but this time, he walked to the front door, hat in hand. He looked wrecked, eyes bloodshot, suit rumpled. Elias, he said, standing on my porch, I'm done. They froze my commission payments because I couldn't get you to sell, and now Linda is trying to set me up as the fall guy for the vandalism. He pulled a stack of emails from his jacket. This is everything. The instructions from Linda, the payments from the shell company Viridianscapes, the plan to bribe the county inspector. I want immunity, and I want to see her burn. I looked at the man who had tried to buy my heritage a month ago and saw a rat jumping off a sinking ship. But even a rat can be useful. You talk to Sarah, I said, opening the screen door, and you better sing loud. With Marcus flipped and the evidence piling up, the trap was set, but Linda Prescott had one final, desperate card to play. We knew from the wiretaps that she was panicking about the trenches and the silence from Marcus. She decided to accelerate the timeline. The trial was set for a Monday. We knew she wouldn't show up empty-handed. She needed me discredited before the gavel fell. The night before the court date, Sheriff Calloway texted me one word, tonight. I sat in the dark on my porch, old Bess across my lap, not to shoot, but to witness. The air was thick with humidity and anticipation. Down by the pond, the infrared cameras were rolling, beaming the feed directly to the sheriff's tactical van parked a mile down the road. I watched the shadows detach themselves from the tree line. 2 men carrying heavy sacks of chemical fertilizer, moving toward the water that sustained my herd. They were coming to kill my land. My heart hammered against my ribs, not from fear, but from the terrible, heavy knowledge that people could be this wicked. I wanted to run down there, to scream, to tackle them, but I stayed frozen. I had to let them commit the crime. I had to let them unscrew the cap. Just as the first man tilted the bag over the water, floodlights erupted from the brush, blinding white beams cutting through the darkness. Sheriff's Department. Drop it. On the ground. Now, I watched the feed as they scrambled, slipping in the mud, handcuffed face down in the dirt they tried to poison. It was over. The physical war was done. But the real battle, the one for the truth, was just starting in the courtroom, and I intended to be in the front row when Linda Prescott's world crumbled. The courtroom in the county seat smelled of lemon polish and old anxiety, a stark contrast to the smell of rain and sagebrush I was used to, but it felt like a battlefield all the same. I sat at the plaintiff's table next to Sarah Jenkins, who looked sharp enough to cut glass in her navy suit, while across the aisle, Linda Prescott sat with a posture so rigid she looked like she'd been starched. She was whispering furiously to her lawyer, a high-priced suit from the city, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. The gallery was packed. Maya Rostova's blog posts had gone viral, and half the county had turned out to see the showdown between the stubborn rancher and the HOA from hell. The trial didn't start with a bang, but with a slow, methodical dismantling. Sarah was surgical. She didn't just present the evidence, she wove a narrative. She put the timeline on the projector, the drone flights, the harassment letters, the slashed tires, layering the abuse until the jury looked physically uncomfortable. Then came the audio. When the recording of Linda played, her voice tinny and cruel echoing through the quiet room, saying, "If we can't make him sell, we'll make it impossible for him to exist." The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Linda stared straight ahead, her face a mask of porcelain indifference, but I saw her hand trembling where it clutched her pearl necklace. But the killing blow wasn't the audio, it was the traitor. When Marcus Trent took the stand, the air left the room. He detailed the money trail, the shell company Viridianscapes, and how Linda had personally authorized the payments for the thugs who cut my fences. He spoke softly, shamefaced, but every word was a nail in her coffin. Then, Sarah played the video from the night before, the night vision footage of the men dumping poison into my pond, interspersed with their confession tapes from the interrogation room where they named Linda as their employer. The jury didn't even need to deliberate long. When the foreman read the verdict, guilty on counts of conspiracy, property destruction, and attempted environmental sabotage, Linda didn't scream or cry. She just slumped, like a marionette whose strings had been cut, realizing that her power, her influence, and her gated community prestige meant nothing against the weight of the truth. The judge sentenced her to 7 years and dissolved the Willow Creek Heights board immediately, freezing their assets to pay for the damages to my farm. Walking out of that courthouse, I expected to feel triumphant, like a cowboy riding into the sunset, but mostly, I just felt tired. Sheriff Calloway met me on the steps, tipping his hat. "Hell of a fight, Elias," he said. "Hell of a fight." "I just want to go home, Jim," I told him. And I did. I drove back to the ranch, the sun dipping low and painting the sky in bruises of purple and orange. I stopped at the gate, the one they had tried to force open, the one they had disrespected, and I nailed a new sign to the post. It didn't say "keep out" or "no trespassing." It simply read, "Thorn Legacy Ranch, EST 1954, still here." In the months that followed, the silence returned to the land, but it was a different kind of silence. It wasn't the lonely quiet of before, it was the peaceful quiet of safety. The heavy equipment of Willow Creek was auctioned off, the half-built expansions were halted, and the land adjacent to mine was bought by the county to be turned into a nature preserve. Ironically, exactly what the HOA claimed they wanted, but without the fake rules. Marcus Trent, believe it or not, asked for a job. He said he was done with suits and lies. I put a shovel in his hand and told him to start digging post holes. He's not much of a ranch hand yet, but he's learning that blisters on your hands feel better than guilt in your soul. I still walk the fence line every morning and evening. The scars on the land are healing. The grass has grown over the trenches I dug to scare them. The pond is clear and teeming with life. But the scars on me, they're a bit deeper. I learned that you can't just mind your own business in this world anymore. Sometimes, you have to fight to keep the things that define you. My grandfather used to say that land is the only thing that remembers you. People forget, stories fade, but the dirt keeps the shape of your boots. I stood my ground not just for the cows or the barn, but for the principle that a man's life shouldn't be erased just because someone else thinks it's an eyesore. But as I sit here on the porch, watching the sun bleed out over the horizon, listening to the wind rattle the dry leaves, I find myself wondering about the cost of it all. We cheered when Linda went to jail. We felt the rush of justice. But it makes you ask a hard question, doesn't it? Here is the question I want you to argue about. We love to see the little guy win and the bully get crushed. But was my victory truly justice, or just revenge wrapped in a court order? I baited them. I trapped them. I let them walk right up to the edge of poisoning my land just to make sure the handcuffs stuck. Does fighting fire with fire make you a hero, or does it just mean everything ends up burned? Did Linda deserve to lose her entire life over a property dispute? Or was she just a symptom of a world that values property values over human values? You tell me. I'll be here, watching the fence.